it back on. Maybe. Just make sure everyone's awake. How's this? Got the mic on here?
She's inside the cabinet.
Oh. Okay. Let's do this. Is this any better? Can you hear me back okay? All right, I think it's the problem that there are two mics working against each other. How is this now? Can you hear me okay in the back there? All right. We'll see how that goes. I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Paige is going to do her magic back there, but I think we might be all set up for now. Let's hope it stays like that. And I want to start off with welcoming you all here to the Frontier Culture Museum. It's so great to see so many new and familiar faces. I appreciate you all taking the time to spend this hour with us here this evening. And I also want to extend my gratitude to the Virginia Humanities for sponsoring this lecture series. Also, Lee Enterprise for being our exclusive media sponsor, and of course the wonderful American Frontier Culture Foundation, who supports our programs every single day. We couldn't do it without them. We also started planning our 2024 calendar events for the calendar of 2024. So please keep an eye on our social media and our website, and we also love to hear your input. So we have surveys back there, we have QR codes in 3 spots. Please let us know what you think of the lecture. We'd love to get your input and feedback so we can continue to improve our programming for you and your family here. But without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Nikki Taylor. She's professor of history at Howard University, and she specializes in 19th century African American history. Her subspecialties are in urban African American women and intellectual history. She received her undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania and a master's degree and PhD from Duke University. Dr. Taylor has won several fellowships, including a Fulbright, Social Science Research Council, and Woodrow Wilson. Dr. Taylor's latest book, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, Enslaved Women's Lethal Resistance, which is also for sale at the back after the lecture. Our wonderful friends from the book Dragon Bookstore from downtown Stanton are selling the books, and you can purchase them for $24.95 plus tax, and she will take cash or credit card as well. But Dr. Taylor's latest book was recently released by Cambridge University Press, and it is Dr. Taylor's 4th book. The book examines enslaved women who used lethal violence to resist slavery from the colonial to antebellum eras, challenging all previous interpretations about the nature of their resistance. And I'd like to start us off with a review of Dr. Taylor's book. This book is a powerful, gripping, and violent telling of enslaved women's resistance. It is hard but necessary scholarship. The past 5 years have led to an explosion of cutting-edge research that centers Black women in nuanced ways. And Dr. Taylor's new book is a welcome part of this welcome wave. So please join me in welcoming Professor Taylor.
Hello, thank you all for coming. Staunton, Virginia. Are you all from Staunton? Stanton. Sorry. These big city people don't even bother to get the name of your town right. I'm so sorry for that. But I really appreciate you coming out. I want to start by thanking The Frontier Cultural Museum, specifically Dorette, who a year ago invited me to this lecture. So I'm really, it would have been my first book talk, but somebody else asked me later, and then I did it last week. But I thank you. I also want to thank Virginia Humanities as well, American Frontier Cultural Foundation, Lee Enterprises, and also Dragon Books, who came on last minute to do this Hercules mission of bringing the books. I really appreciate all of you. Before I get started, let me say that if you are kind of not really able to hear really gruesome details, this probably won't be a good lecture for you. Is everybody okay? Okay, so I'll proceed. Can everybody hear me? Okay, let me set my timer so that I don't go off. In the wee hours of an April morning in 1848 in Jasper County, Mississippi, a 14-year-old enslaved girl named Sicily ran over and alerted her neighbors that something terrible had happened at the home of Dr. James Longan, to whom she had been hired. 5 neighbors rushed over to the Longan property. When they entered the front gate, they found the bloody body of Dr. Longan's wife, Ann, still in her nightclothes, barefoot. They followed a bloody trail, or 2 bloody trails of footprints, back to a rather crudely constructed one-room house with a quilt functioning as the front door. Inside, they found the doctor's body lying on a mattress on the floor, decapitated. His severed fingers were laying on top of his body. The Longans had 2 infants. One baby had her head crushed, and another one had miraculously escaped all serious injury. Cicely, the 14-year-old, recounted a very harrowing story of 5 home invaders, okay? Interracial crew, if you can believe it. 3 white, 2 black, who had intended to rob the family. Now, according to her, the gang of men had chased her and Ann Longan out of the home, but she had managed to outrun their attackers and narrowly escaped being bludgeoned herself. And her story seemed very compelling and believable until it didn't. Circumstantial evidence would be Cicely's undoing, standing there in the dark of the night with only lanterns to light up the gruesome scene. The neighbors noticed that she had blood on her dress, blood splatter to be exact. Now that discovery drew the immediate suspicion to the young girl, because blood splatter suggested to them that she had been the one wielding the axe. Neighbors at the scene ordered her, in their 19th century version of forensic science, they said, "Hey, Cicely, we want you to match your feet to these footprints." And she did, and they matched perfectly, according to all those at the scene. They noticed that Cicely was hiding a coin purse under her dress, so somebody grabbed it, and they found $11, and she insisted the money was hers. And then other people said, "Oh, wait a minute, Cicely, we saw Dr. Longan with that a couple of days ago in town." But nonetheless, for the investigators who were there at the scene, the neighbors are investigators in the 19th century, they concluded that the money didn't belong to Dr. Longan, and that the money must have been Cicely's primary motive for these gruesome murders. Cicely, though, offered a different possible motive in her confession. Her confession came a couple of years later. She said she wasn't happy that her real owners had hired her out to Dr. Longan, and she's referring to the very common practice here in Virginia of hiring out, which is akin to renting out your enslaved person. She told people that she had been employed by the Longans against her will. She also seemed to have a very robust history of resistance at the Longan home. Just 2 weeks before the murder, she had burned their house to the ground, causing the family a total loss. And that was the real reason why they didn't have any furniture and no front door and only a mattress laying on the floor. In that 1850 confession, she stated that she never intended to kill Mrs. Longan or the baby, that they were sort of collateral damage of sorts. Her real target, she said, had been Dr. Longan. And she didn't really give clues, but she did reference the fact that, basically he and other men had been having sex with her in the neighborhood. But whatever her grievance was, it had been grave enough that she had nearly decapitated him, okay? So she even hinted that she had taken the money, the $11, as some sort of retribution for what the men had done to her in the neighborhood. But the person to whom she divulged these details about what had happened to her told the court and even the investigators that night that she declined to repeat them out of a desire for decency. So the indecent things that Sicily must have uttered to that person were rendered unspeakable in Victorian era society, which means that her truth, the details, are forever excluded from the court testimony and also from the historical record. So what kind of justice system did Sicily face as an enslaved girl in antebellum Mississippi? Based on the Mississippi Slave Code at the time, an enslaved person, regardless of age, there was no leniency because she was a child, but if they merely assaulted a white person with the intent to kill, that was punishable by death. Even using abusive or provoking or aggressive or insulting language against a white person was considered a very serious offense. And for capital offenses, though, unlike on the East Coast, enslaved people in Mississippi had the right to legal counsel and a trial by jury, which was not necessarily the case in places like Virginia. Okay? Before you feel too hopeful, though, about Sicily's fate, Mississippi state law required that half of the jury pool be slave owners. Okay? So much for a jury by her peers. Enslaved people could not testify in court. That's no surprise to any of us. But free blacks could. However, false testimony, and this is a warning in the Mississippi statute, false testimony by any black witness could result in both ears being nailed to the pillory, then cut off, followed by 39 lashes on their bare backs at the public whipping post. So clearly that was a serious deterrent for anybody to testify in any case, much less a murder case. Enslaved Mississippians, shockingly enough or surprisingly enough, could appeal their convictions. Just to put this in perspective, some of the newer slave states like Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, all offered the opportunity for appeals, whereas the older slave states, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Maryland, did not until the 19th century. And a few of them didn't offer that right until 1865, the year we were freed from slavery. Sicily pled not guilty at her trial and was summarily convicted despite that not guilty plea and sentenced to death on the above circumstantial evidence. She exercised her right to an appeal in Mississippi's High Court of Errors and Appeals and also the state Supreme Court. In her reasons for the appeal, she cited the judge had given the jury bad instructions, he had failed to honor her request for a new trial, and other reasons. She didn't finally admit her guilt until after those courts upheld her convictions and when she was on the dawn of her execution. But nonetheless, those cases, those appellate cases, those appeals cases are how I, in 2021, found Sicily in the records. As shocking as it was, Sicily is in fact part of a healthy number of enslaved women who exercised lethal slave resistance in the United States. She's a case study, much like the ones featured in my book, although she is not in my book. I had to leave you something for the book. And although violent resistance to slavery was not the preferred kind among slave women, the fact that it happened at all, despite the constant surveillance and repression for them as enslaved people and as enslaved women, that's what makes these cases remarkable. So before I get into the meat and the potatoes of this talk, let me not mislead any of you. We want to just all have kind of a similar assumptions to start off. First of all, violence, especially lethal violence, was considered the prerogative of white men in the slave era. They wielded the power and authority to kill, mortally injure, or maim, not just their enslaved people, their wives, their servants, many of them white or immigrant, their employees, and even other white men. Yet none of that societal, white-on-white, free-on-free violence could ever trump the violence that was required to maintain slavery. That violence at that time in history was unparalleled, incomparable, and incomprehensible in the history of human relations in this country. Slave owners, their wives, their parents, siblings, overseers, and even their minor children often delivered inhumane and merciless discipline to their enslaved people, even within the black community. Violence is often understood to be the prerogative of black men, even to this day. These patriarchal ideas about who can and should have the power and the authority to wield violence may make a lot of people uncomfortable in this room. When I have talked to people about my project, they're like, oh no, I don't want to hear about women doing this. I'm like, what? Because those are like patriarchal, kind of sexist ideas that women can't also wield the same kind of power. But it all affects how we do work as historians. So jettisoning these ideas about who can and should wield violence allows us to get into the heart of what happened in American society. And I will say that maybe with the exception of indigenous women, black women were the least violent people in American society, even with everything you're going to read in my book this weekend, okay? The least violent people in American society. So my motivation to write the book. Most historians have long insisted, many of you came into this room with the same assumption, that enslaved women rarely chose armed, lethal, or overt, explicit types of resistance. In fact, the late historian Stephanie Camp, for example, emphasized that women rejected explicit or confrontational violence in favor of covert, non-confrontational, everyday acts of resistance, which included insolence, talking back, having a bad attitude, muttering under one's breath, pretending to be sick, pretending to be pregnant, all the things we're familiar with, and even temporarily running away. All of those things fall under the umbrella of everyday resistance. Camp expanded the definition in her book of everyday resistance and included things like appropriating food and even appropriating luxury items like hair bows and dresses. And she included those as well. So we're grateful that she expanded the definition. But despite the varied and creative ways enslaved women practiced everyday resistance, historians have categorized it as non-threatening and less likely to undermine or challenge the racial or social order the way a slave revolt would, for example. Not only has women's resistance to slavery been exclusively understood as this softer variety, but it has also been mischaracterized, even, I argue, as it relates to organized collective resistance. With the exception of Vanessa Holden's book, have you all read that? Okay, yeah, it's really good. It's about Virginia, you should get it. With the exception of her book and Rebecca Hall's brilliant article, historians have categorized slave revolt and uprisings as a preserve of men for the reasons I stated earlier, leaving the impression that women rarely led or participated in collective, organized, or violent acts of resistance. Women's participation within the histories of the major slave rebellions is not generally examined. And when they are mentioned in these texts, they're usually positioned as the wives of the main architects of these revolts and plots. So these assumptions are how I entered and got interested in this topic. I just said, wait, this can't be. There has to be other types of resistance. And besides that, my absolute favorite book of all time, history book, of course, history nerd, is a book called Celia, a Slave by Melton McLaurin. It's about 40 years old, and the whole book is about this one case in Missouri. And so my book is like an homage to McLaurin in its structure. But in terms of how difficult it is to do this type of work, it's very difficult. It's nearly impossible. As many of you know, many of you are familiar with history, I'm sure. The lives of individual enslaved women are hard to really chart and to follow in the historical record. Usually historians can find only little bitty scraps of evidence about them. We can find numbers, like in a census, slave census, dates maybe, the day they died or were sold, possibly a name, but rarely their voices or opinions. So it can be a challenging task to write about them. And typically, the white people who own them, their enslavers, are more discoverable in the historical record for obvious reasons. But the irony of this research is that it was the reverse. So basically, the enslaved women who use lethal force are readily discoverable in the historical record. And I could barely find anything about their enslavers, their names, their ages, or other pertinent biographical information. I had never encountered that, so I thought that was just ironic. So in other words, it's because of their lethal resistance that these particular Black women's voices were recorded and preserved in the archive. The archival evidence I use in my book is hardly new. It may be new to you, but some of the things I use have been used by other historians. But not in a full-throated examination in the way that I do. I started this research by looking at this. There's some slave databases. They're very dated. Somebody needs to update them. I decided that shouldn't be me. It's a lot of work. But I started there, and in the slave databases, SB database is the one that I really relied on. And you can pull out, you see woman, the date they were executed, the place, and so from there I worked backwards to who are these women? Why were they executed? So that's how I did the research. Maryland also has a very useful database. The biggest archive on these women, are you sitting, is in Virginia. The biggest archive is countless. I just think whatever historical gods made Virginians preserve all their historical records. No other state comes close. Did you guys know that? Yeah. No other state can touch Virginia in terms of the preservation of all slave records, but specifically these slave records. So I'm very grateful for that. Other evidence to corroborate the things found could be newspapers, colonial legislative records, coroner's inquest records, journals of the House of Burgesses, which is a colonial lower house, compensatory slave petitions. And what those are is when an owner's enslaved person was executed, the state would reimburse them. Who knew? Wow, they didn't have to lose a penny for it. And then transcripts, court transcripts from criminal, slave courts, and even courts of oyer and terminer. Oyer and terminer means to hear and determine, and it was the court that Virginia used in its cases. So if you're looking for these things, oyer and terminer is the name of the court where slave felony cases were heard. They also could be found in the Supreme Court records and appellate courts. Remember, that's how I found Sicily. But my book, this book here, features case studies of 7 women, like Cecily, who used lethal force against their enslavers. It is not intended to be exhaustive. I left that for somebody else, younger eyes, younger legs, younger back and neck, but that wasn't my job. I do discuss dozens of other additional similar cases in each chapter. I deliberately feature 7 cases that span across time and distance, from colonial Massachusetts, Revolutionary era North Carolina, early America, Pennsylvania, and antebellum Texas and Virginia. I place the 7 women featured in my book in their proper historical, legal, and legal context, and provide the reader with a snapshot of the worlds that they lived in. I not only featured a different woman in each different location, but each chapter also features a different murder weapon. From household poisons, oh, that one is rich. Okay, don't get any ideas, wives in this room, about how to get rid of your husbands, please. Household poisons, water, fire, axes, hatchets, fence posts, and a feather bed. In fact, my book proves that any mundane household item could be used to wage lethal resistance when in the hands of a motivated enslaved woman. And some were more effective than others, and the most effective, in my opinion, is fire. Now let me grab this book, because I'm going to read to you something on page 112. If you have the book, you can follow along. 112, and it's that last paragraph. In the final analysis, fire is the most formidable, if not effective, weapon enslaved women wielded to resist slavery, because of its capacity to destroy everything their owners value. A successful arson leaves in its wake economic, emotional, and physical damage for the target. It had the capacity to kill people and livestock and erase homes, barns, businesses, and towns, entire towns. As Reverend Stanford said at Rose's execution, arson's potential to harm an entire family, community, or town makes it worse than murder. If victims escape with their lives and without injury, destruction of their property often brought untold economic devastation. For example, in 1736, William Cox of Virginia petitioned the House of Burgesses requesting financial assistance. He told the body that he had been reduced to poverty. Again, he was a slave owner, which is top 5% down to poverty. He said after his enslaved woman had broken into his home, critically wounded his son, burned his tobacco house, murdered his other enslaved people before taking her own life. That all happened while he was at church. Although arson was just one element of her destruction, Cox's enslaved woman destroyed every bit of his financial wealth, rendering him destitute. White slave owners who watched their belongings, home, and businesses burn lost far more than just property. Intentional fire also burned a hole through their sense of safety and peace. And if enslaved women achieved nothing else but that with the fires they set, they returned to their owners the same terrorism that they experienced on a daily basis. As far as my argument, I spent a lot of time, once I got, sat down to write, spent a lot of time thinking about the cases before I shaped the book. And I tried to answer a pressing and recurring question, which is, what factors had led some enslaved women to lethal resistance? Of course, with so many women across time and space in this book, different types of slavery, they articulated many reasons for why they resorted to lethal force. I found that the women who murdered their owners in the cases in these records didn't have a global grievance against slavery itself, which I found very surprising. I went into this book thinking, oh yeah, they want freedom, but that's not what the evidence showed me. They did not strive to end slavery or murder slave owners en masse. None of the women discussed in my book killed to secure personal or even collective physical freedom. Not one. The motivational thread that ran through all of these cases is injustice. In light of that, my argument in the book, if you like to read history books, authors should always have an argument. My advisor, Peter Wood, taught me years ago at Duke. So my argument is very simple. Enslaved women did in fact resist slavery with lethal force, and when they did, their own ideas about injustice were a central motivation. It is no surprise that injustice would be at the center of my argument because, as historian Eugene Genovese declares in his seminal text, violent confrontation with injustice lay at the core of any revolt against slavery. And I happen to agree with Genovese. Because protection and justice for enslaved women were elusive through traditional, moral, and legal channels. Moral, I mean through the church or anybody that really had compassion, or even legal channels. The only form available to them, the only form of justice that was available, is that they seized with their own hands, a type of personal justice. So you'll see the title is Wild Justice up here. Philosopher, that was the first title. My publisher said, that's not going to work. So that's why the subtitle was changed. But Wild Justice is from Francis Bacon, who's a philosopher. And he kind of critiques revenge as being kind of out of control, outside the scope of law. But that's what these women were doing. So I took that out, but that nonetheless is revenge, or personal justice is wild justice. And while Sicily's case is about one woman who acted alone, others in the book are about women who acted collectively. At least a few case studies in the book feature women who had more than one conspirators. So a second intervention I make is that I kind of have a definition of revolt where I borrow from Rebecca Haw and Genovese and put their definitions together to come up with mine, which is basically organized, coordinated, violent, or lethal acts of resistance that are motivated by unbearable exploitation or injustice. So that's the way I define it, and I use Genovese's and Rebecca Haw's definition of revolt. So that definition that I just read aptly describes the women in my book. So yes, women led slave revolts, but their revolts function differently than Nat Turner's and all the ones we're familiar with. Theirs were smaller, local plots of revenge against their own owners. So you see how that's different than what Nat Turner was doing? But interdisciplinary methods and frames inform this work. It's a history book, but I had to borrow from other methods in order to really bring these women to life. This is a history book, nonetheless. But I use a frame I call a Black feminist practice of justice. I term it a Black feminist practice of justice, not because these enslaved women were feminists, but mostly because Black feminist theory is what allows me to amplify them, and it allows me to amplify their voices and their experiences and put them center in the work, and not just what was done to them, not just what their owner's perspective was or the court's perspective. Their own perspective of how they live their lives is what's center in this book. So I decolonized the archive and the discipline, and it allowed me to deepen my understanding of these women as historical agents. Without a Black feminist theoretical framework, their actions could seem impulsive, motivated by anger, irrational, disproportionate, and even disorganized. In other words, if I didn't center them and their experiences and kind of push back against these things, then I ran the risk as a historian of kind of reviving the age-old stereotype of the angry Black woman. So I had to be careful not to let this be an excuse for people to say, see, we told you, look at how angry and violent you are. So that's why I was very careful with this book and how I approached it. And it was important to me in this book to emphasize that these women were intellectuals who thought and acted on a philosophy that they crafted. They had a philosophy of justice. We don't tend to think of enslaved people as being intellectuals, but I think we're doing them a disservice, and ourselves as people looking back. They had a very different definition of justice than what their enslavers and local officials defined as justice. In the simplest terms for them, it was relief from injustice, this racialized, gendered injustice that they were experiencing as enslaved women. But on a deeper level, what does this philosophy mean? It boiled down to a sense of fairness, decency, and humane treatment, which they articulated, they negotiated, and renegotiated these things over and over and over again. So a Black feminist philosophy of justice has at its root a basic understanding that justice has to be centered on those concepts that I just articulated. Any failure to do that is an injustice. So what are some examples? Chattel slavery is the biggest injustice, but there are other ones too, like sexual assault or disrespectful name calling of mothers in front of their children. So all of that will fall under the umbrella of injustice. Black women's philosophy of justice was a powerful current flowing within them. And their owners had no clue that they harbored such strong views about justice, which was a serious, serious misstep. Justice was so important to these women that they were willing to kill for it and more willing to die for it than even freedom, which they hardly ever articulated. Those who seized justice in my project had very deep and compelling reasons for murdering their owners or their enslavers, which they usually articulated, like Sicily. In another instance, in antebellum Virginia, not far from here, just, well, maybe it is far from here. I'm not that familiar with the geography. But 60-year-old Nellie explained why she and her kin, her daughter and her grandchildren, beat their enslaver to death. She said, "He was a hard master. He would not allow any of us to go from home, leave the farm, or give us any of the privileges which other enslaved people have." And what she's talking about is time off, time to visit each other, have their parties. And she said this, and this got me worked up. "He told us that we should stay home during Christmas, holidays, and work." How many of you are teachers in this room? Yeah, that's enough for a revolt. We need our Christmas vacations, right? So they were also animated to revolt at the idea that they wouldn't have their Christmas holidays. She also complained that they weren't given enough food to eat. Now some might say, well, very few people got enough food to eat. But it meant something to them. They righted that perceived wrong. When their quarters were searched after the people found their owner, officials found a catalog of food that they had taken from his kitchen, including sugar, coffee, molasses, tea, 2 pieces of bacon, sausage, and spare ribs. They finally got their the meals that they desired and craved. But many of the enslaved women who used lethal violence against their owners were neither impulsive nor irrational. To the contrary, the core of these women's actions is their rationality, organization, and forethought in carefully planning every detail of these murders. So this is something they just did because they were a fit of rage. They planned this for days, weeks, months, and years. They decided, they recruited hands, helpers when they needed to, delegated responsibilities, decided which weapon would be used and who would wield it. They also predetermined the day and the time of the fatal attack. And they also orchestrated fairly sophisticated excuses for why it wasn't them. Oscar-worthy acting. I was just shocked. They also constructed fairly sophisticated plans to avoid suspicion afterwards, like pretending to be pregnant. And pretending to be pregnant meant that they weren't going to execute you if they thought you were pregnant. And so, you know, that's, you have to appreciate the genius in that. Now, on the surface, it may seem to many in this room that many who read my book, that they offer little restraint in how they murdered their owners. The bludgeonings that you're going to read in this book seem out of proportion to our modern sensibilities. Murder in exchange for cruelty doesn't seem proportionate to most of us living today. Certainly, murdering children of their enslavers also seems unusually just to us free people living today. But enslaved women are not us, okay? They are not us. For teenage Chloe, it was the cycle of the Carruthers family, their constant surveillance and reporting on her, followed by a trail of brutal beatings by her mistress that drove her to brood over bloody revenge. In her confession in Pennsylvania in the early days of America, on pages 81 and 82 in the book, she said, "My motive in the first place was this. I knew that the children were compelled by my mistress to give information respecting some parts of my conduct, for which I was severely corrected, far beyond the demerit of the fault. To cut off this means of communication was the first end I promised myself, but the second and the greatest motive was to bring all the misery I possibly could upon the family, but especially my mistress." So Chloe here, she's a young child, maybe 17, 18, she critiques the disproportionality of her mistress's violence, indicating that even she, as a young woman, was very clear about proportionality even in that moment. But because she had no one that was going to deliver her from that endless cycle of tattling, surveilling, and beatings, she decided to rebalance the scales of justice herself. Not surprisingly, these women all met with extremely violent ends. Many were burned alive. We always say, we all know the Salem witches were not burned alive. That's a false narrative. But enslaved women were burned alive for this type of revolt. The women in my book fully accepted the consequences of their actions after their trials. Rose Butler, she was hanged she was in New York, so it's the North, she was hanged. Her last words before she was executed in Washington Square Park in New York City, many of you have been gallivanting in Washington Square Park over the place where she was hanged. She said, "I am satisfied to the justness of my fate. It is all right." At her execution in Galveston in 1858, Lucy spoke for one last time after being silent the whole time. She expressed a perfect willingness to die and hope for forgiveness in the next life. In antebellum Virginia, R.G. Davis told the court that when he told Nellie that she better be prepared to meet her God, she replied that she was all right on that question. Anith, though, had a different tone in colonial North Carolina. She vowed to follow her owner into the afterlife and kill him again there. The fact that these women persisted in their plans despite a certain death sentence demonstrates that they were willing to die pursuing their version of justice. In conclusion, motivated to lethal force by different things than enslaved men, women did not always strive to destroy slavery or the power structure. Instead, they were motivated to destroy the unjust person in power. Only then did they find a measure of justice and freedom. Thank you.